Dr. Gordon, you're recognized as a leading expert on healing population-wide psychological trauma. How did you become interested in this?
Well, psychiatry is all about trauma. The origins of modern psychiatry with Freud and Breuer and Janet at the end of the 19th century. And what they understood is the power of psychological trauma, particularly early in life, to affect us later in life and to produce all the anguish and the symptoms that psychiatrists saw. So all psychiatrists, presumably, and mental health professionals are interested in trauma. I became interested in it way back when I was working at the National Institute of Mental Health as a researcher, and we were working with homeless and runaway kids all over the country, all of whom pretty much had lived through traumatic experiences in their homes and on the street. So the question was, how do you reach a couple million kids who are living on the street or, just hustling? And they don't want to go see conventional therapists. They were coming to runaway houses and calling up hotlines that I was working with. So I became interested in how could we work with all of these kids and their families, and we needed to train people who were accessible and available to them. So I saw the problem. I could see it on a local level in DC. I could see it on a national level. And the question was what to do and how to think outside the box and meet the needs of these kids. The other piece is right from the beginning. I've always been interested in how people can understand and help themselves and how they can come together and form communities to help each other. So it was kind of natural for that to move into, as I started the Center for Mind-Body Medicine, and we began to create this whole program to help people deal with stress and trauma, and it was working well in the United States. I began to become interested in the possibility of working in some of the most troubled places on the planet. It was kind of with a question. Does this approach that works so well, does this approach I've used here in the United States over the years with runaway and homeless kids that we've used in hospitals and clinics, can we work on a large scale in an organized way with whole communities? And that's what I've been trying to answer that question for the last 20 some years. And the answer is yes, it is possible to do it. And it's very interesting. It's exciting. It's so hopeful to be able to come into a place in a situation where there's enormous destruction and where you can be helpful to the whole community of people. And it's not just one-on-one, it's training people, it's creating programs. And there's a sense of satisfaction in doing that.
That brings me to my next question. So what exactly is the difference between individual trauma and collective trauma?
Well, individual trauma is the individual experience of collective trauma. So they're intimately related. Each of us, if we live long enough, is going to experience trauma. You know this very well from your own life. I know it from my life, losing people we love. If we were fortunate enough to have a childhood that was, reasonably peaceful or not too crazy, by the time we get to be young adults or midlife, things start happening. Parents, grandparents die. We may have major disappointments at work. We may get divorced. Partners may die. So that's traumatic. I think we have to recover that understanding that trauma is a part of life. And then as we grow old, if we're fortunate enough to grow old, we have to deal with frailty, physical frailty. We have to deal with loss of loved ones and with our own impending death. So trauma is a part of life. Collective trauma is what we're all experiencing right now in the middle of this pandemic. In addition to the individual trauma that we may go through, we're experiencing a collective sense of threat, of danger, loss, limitation, uncertainty, which is, I don't know anybody in the United States, and I don't even know anybody overseas who has not been affected, not been traumatized. Trauma is a Greek word that means injury, and to the body, mind, or spirit. And I think all of us have suffered, from that during this time. My brother died at the beginning of the pandemic. That's both an individual trauma for me, but it's also part of the collective trauma. So many people in this country have lost family members or close friends just during this last 11 months.
So it really is when a massive event you know, precipitates scores of individual traumas, and the whole community has to grapple with it together.
Exactly. Exactly. And, when we were in Haiti together, when you and I were there together, and we were the Center for Mind Body Medicine, we were working with the whole city of Port-au-Prince.
Following the earthquake.
Yeah, after the earthquake in 2010. That's collective trauma. And we could see as we talked with those kids whom we were meeting at the hospital, each of those kids also had an individual trauma, physical injury, loss of a family member, but the whole society was affected. And that's what we're seeing here now.
What are some other examples, Jim or Dr. Gordon, of collective trauma?
Well, any of these climate related disasters in Haiti, we saw the earthquake, and after Katrina, New Orleans, we've been working in Houston after Hurricane Harvey, the wildfires in Northern California, school shootings are traumatic. We're working in Broward County, Florida, and it's not just the one school, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, where the tragedy of 17 people killed happened. The whole county. You go to schools that are 40-minute drive away and talk with the kids and the teachers there. There's a high, ever since those February 14th, 2018 shootings, there's a high level of anxiety throughout the system. So the trauma spreads. And all of those are examples of collective trauma that we're experiencing and continuing to experience.
I was going to say it's probably traumatizing for anyone who goes to school. When you hear about Newtown, when you hear about what happened in Parkland, Florida, when you hear about, when I was covering Columbine, I think these are very traumatic events, no matter what, because everyone goes to school and everyone thinks, well, it could happen here.
Exactly. And what we do to deal with the trauma often enough, even if it may make sense, like metal detectors in schools. When you and I were going to school, there were nobody even imagined such a thing, no matter where, no matter what high school or what grade school. Now there are metal detectors in so many schools. So that brings up, for many people, that brings up memories of what has happened and what might happen again.
I wanted to ask you about re-trauma. Selfishly, when my husband died, if I had a failed relationship following that, it would almost disproportionately affect me because I was almost re-traumatized by the loss of yet another person. So everyone probably processes trauma in different ways depending on previous traumas, right?
Exactly. That's very, very important. And it's important that we understand that that doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. This is what happens to us on a biological level, is that when an event happens, you lost someone who you loved very much. And then the actuality of another loss, or even the threat of that loss, brings up many of those same feelings. I think many people have this. I mean, this is one of the reasons why loss of any relationship is so traumatic, especially for people who have lost or had difficult relationships, say with family members. And then later on, there's a breakup with a girlfriend or a boyfriend. And it's overwhelming. I know for me as well, when I had my first breakup with my first girlfriend when I was in high school, I wondered, why am I so upset? And then as I began to think about it and look at it, it had something to do with the childhood in which the people who were taking care of me, it wasn't very constant. It was changing all the time. And it was very painful for my mother not to be there. So I never thought about it, but it was there in my biology and my psychology. So another loss was more painful, just as you're describing with after the death of your husband.
What about generational trauma? We hear about, trauma being passed down. And I'm curious, is there a physiological aspect to this, or is it, just shared collective memory? What have you learned about that?
It's both. So, for example, if you are a Black person in the United States, you're dealing with what's been passed down through the family, but what people are telling you about what happened to ancestors' slavery and what happened during Reconstruction and what happened more recently during Jim Crow era. And then you're experiencing it in your life now because there is still systemic racism in our society. So and then every incident exacerbates that pain and that trauma. In addition, there is this biological passing down of trauma. And the way it seems to go is that when we are traumatized, often there are changes in structures in our chromosomes that in turn affect the genes. So this is not like what we learned about in 8th grade science, where X-rays, create physical damage to the genes. These are changes in molecules that are on the chromosomes, in the chromosomes, and they're called epigenetic changes. Epi means above in Greek. And these changes in these molecules, one of them is a methyl molecule, 1 carbon, 3 hydrogen atoms. When those changes occur, it affects the way the genes act in the body. So let's say we've experienced a major trauma those epigenetic changes affect genes that help us to deal with stress. So if I've been traumatized before, I may have more difficulty dealing with stress because of these changes in my chromosomes. Now that's in this lifetime. When women are pregnant and have been traumatized, those changes are transmitted to the child in utero, and those children have these epigenetic changes. Not always, but often. And also, and this is positively biblical, the changes can be transmitted through 3 generations. We have seen this. There's research that was done in New York, very striking research by Rachel Yehuda at Mount Sinai Medical School, on the children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. And even these children and grandchildren, many of them had the same epigenetic changes in their chromosomes, which made them more vulnerable to stress. And what was so striking about the research is that you could see the same changes even in children and grandchildren who grew up apart from the Holocaust
Wow.
survivors. So it wasn't social interpersonal influence. This is a biological change that happens.
That's fascinating and so important, I think, for people to recognize when trauma affects a particular group, say the children and grandchildren, great grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, or in the case of systemic racism and Black Americans. How can we turn individual or their group trauma into collective trauma and I guess, or collective empathy anyway? Is that the key? Because it seems to me that it could lead to collective understanding and positive social change if other people's trauma in some ways becomes your trauma.
Yeah, no, that's a beautiful thing to say, and it's as Shakespeare said, a consummation devoutly to be wished. And the way it can happen, the way we've been able to make it happen, is to bring people together in small groups and in larger groups, and give them the experience of being able to share their pain, their trauma with one another, and then to learn techniques to deal with the trauma. Now, what we've done over the last 20 years is, in addition to working, let's say, with the groups of teachers and kids and parents in Parkland and in Broward County, Florida, is to work with people who disagree with each other and who sometimes hate each other, and sometimes with people who've been killing each other till shortly before they showed up at our training program. In either case, the crucial piece is for us to shut up and listen to each other, to pay attention. This is why work that you're doing and other journalists are doing can be so important, because the whole idea is that we've all been through this. And if we can see different people who've experienced similar trauma, and we can see the similarities and the differences, that's a big step down the road to the understanding that we all need. And when it can be people who disagree with each other or hate each other, and we've worked in many communities where this has been true. After the war in Kosovo, working with Serbs and Albanians, with Israelis and Palestinians, jointly with community organizers, often with Black community organizers and police who are white and Black and brown, having them together and having them just be quiet and listen to each other. They begin to see the similarities, they begin to see the common humanity. And as they do that, they can relax enough to also appreciate the differences. So it's a matter, and this is one of the difficulties now in our society, is we're so polarized. There are not as many places for people to come together and share what is, after all, a common experience.
I had the most revelatory experience when I was doing a documentary about white anxiety a few years ago. And I was at a fire station in Erie, Pennsylvania with some paramedics. And they were talking about Black Lives Matter, and they were saying all lives matter. And as if on cue, a Black paramedic came in and sat down and started talking about Colin Kaepernick and some of the protests that were going on and how he interpreted and felt about it and talked about the days of lynching, et cetera. And you could see his colleagues listening to him. And suddenly one said, I never really thought about it that way. And they said they never wanted to bring it up. They had never talked about it with their Black colleague because they didn't want to put him in an uncomfortable position. And there we were sitting at a table, just having this conversation. And I think it was so instructive for people to hear directly from someone they knew and liked about what his personal experience was and how he was receiving this movement for social justice.
Yeah, no, it's great. That's exactly what needs to happen. Part of the problem is also that in our society, everybody wants to be strong and tough and
right.
and right, exactly. But that rightness is also a defensive measure. That's what why are we so invested in being right all the time? Why are we so fearful of other opinions and other ways of looking at the world? If you're, and we know this personally, when I'm feeling relaxed and easy and, just kind of open and curious, then I'm happy to hear other opinions. It's when I'm shut down and fearful and I've got to defend myself that I have to be right all the time. So there's a shift that I'm hoping that this collective trauma can help to catalyze if we can find a way to take advantage of it, where we can do exactly what you're suggesting, just listen and pay attention to other people.
First and foremost, I want to say before we dive into this pandemic, which has resulted in so much collective trauma, Jim, is I'm so sorry about your brother who died at the beginning of the pandemic. Do you mind sharing what happened with us?
What happened, I may start crying on the show because I miss him so much. He's my younger brother, he's younger by 13 years, and he had some kind of respiratory problem, sinus infection. He was living in Dallas, Texas. And I'd talk with him maybe about what wound up being a week or 10 days before he died. And he had sinus infection, but he was doing okay. And the doctor said he was doing okay. He just declined. And after he died, I spoke with someone who had spoken with him a few days before, who said that he was very confused. But they never went over to see him. Nobody pushed him to go see a doctor. He was having a party on Saturday night, but nobody was coming because of the pandemic. Everybody was staying home at that point. And so he just died. He died alone at home. And it was tragic for me and for my other brother and for a lot of people who loved him. And we never were positive it was COVID, but it certainly looked like it was COVID-19. We're never able to get a test. And I think that in addition to it being almost certainly COVID-19, the fact that nobody checked up on him was a product of the pandemic as well. So that nobody went over to see how he was doing, even when he didn't respond. And he was a very responsive person. And then, of course, after he died, we weren't really able to gather together to mourn. So my other brother took care of the business that had to be taken care of. What's important, aside from the personal loss and maybe helpful to other people, is that I gave myself time to mourn. So every day for months after he died, I cried, and I set aside time. In a sense, I got up every morning and I could feel the weight in my chest, and I allowed myself to take some time to cry and sometimes yell and scream, why did this have to happen? Why, and I miss him so much. And I gave myself time to mourn. So even though I couldn't do it in person with other people, I was able to go through that experience. And that's crucial, I think. And this is one of the things that people are deprived of during this pandemic, is that
Well,
time to mourn.
this is just one of a myriad of ways, I think, Jim, that the pandemic has affected us individually and collectively. Some people have lost their loved ones. Some people have lost their jobs. Some people, quite frankly, have lost both. Some have lost the experience of working outside the home and feel restricted in their environment. Some people have the loss of their children getting a kind of more traditional, conventional education. It seems there have been such varying degrees of loss, and yet collectively, it's had a huge impact on all of us. Can you talk about that?
Well, I think there is a sense of uncertainty among all of us. And I think the ones who manifest it, particularly that I've observed, are young people who are coming out of college or going into college. That there is a feeling of what's going to happen? What's the world going to be like? Is there a place for me? Plus, they're being deprived of what we have in our society, the rites of passage that we ordinarily have, the rites of graduation, of proms, of being together away from home, away from family at college or university, or in fact at work. So there is a sense of being thrown off. And I think those young people, I have an 18-year-old son, and I can see and feel it in him very much. And they are kind of the canaries in this coal mine of collective trauma right now. The other group that's experiencing it are the most obvious, perhaps, are healthcare providers, frontline healthcare providers. So not only are they being traumatized by the threats, the physical threats to their health and well-being, they're also overwhelmed by what they have to deal with, by the quantity of death, and by their inability to do very much about it. That's what I hear again and again from them. We feel so, we were trained to help people, and there's so little we can do in this circumstance. And also, anybody who is a member of a minority, anybody who is operating on a marginal, income, they're all traumatized because there's been a whole lot of hostility against people who are Black or brown or Native people, and they're dying at much higher rates. So it brings up that previous trauma as well. So it's seeping through the whole society. And when those of us who are more fortunate perhaps and are able to do work from home, we're feeling it too, because it's like the lion is just outside the gates. There's an anxiety about going out and when can I do and what can I do. So I would say there's a general uncertainty, and of course the political situation has compounded that uncertainty. What's going to happen, and what is it going to look like in the future? And people and understandably, we simply don't know.
What happens with communal trauma when everyone is affected? how does it impact the community? Because it seems to me there are all kinds of psychological issues that are bubbling very close to the surface, if not exploding through.
Well, I think the first thing is to understand that trauma affects us on a biological level. And the two basic responses that we have to loss of someone, to threats from outside, to worries about the economy, to
To lack of
systemic
control, by the way, lack of
lack of
personal
control,
control.
is it's a threat. And and we humans react to these sort of psychological, social, as well as physical threats as if it were a threat to our life. And we go into fight or flight response, just as if a lion were actually chasing us. It may be, we're scared about what's going to happen with our work, or we're worried about COVID-19, and our heart races, our blood pressure goes up, our muscles get tense, the part of our brain responsible for fear and anger fires off more, parts of our brain responsible for thoughtful decision making and self-awareness and compassion shuts down. It's harder to connect with other people. And then if you play that out in the social realm, if you're more anxious and irritable, you're going to deal with people in a more anxious and irritable way. It's going to be harder to connect with them. Plus, you're in a state, if you're in a fight or flight state, where your biology is saying, your life is at stake, it's not so easy to connect with other people. So the individual response to trauma, that individual fight or flight response, also manifests in social and collective ways. So, we were talking earlier about understanding other people. Well, if that part of your brain that helps you understand and have compassion isn't working so well, it tends to contribute to the polarization that we see in our society, the fear of the other.
I was going to ask you, is it trauma that is making people so angry, for example, of having to wear a mask because they feel like it flies in the face of their personal liberty? Is it trauma that can help explain the insurrection at the Capitol and all those people storming the Capitol, so angry and so, scary, honestly?
It is scary, and I think people have ways of looking at the world that they've held long before this pandemic. But I think with the trauma of the pandemic and of the very visible, palpable political division, that's exacerbating the situation. That's lighting the fire. The gasoline was there, but this is the match that's made people both so fearful and so angry, and made it even more difficult to connect with and have compassion for the other. So yeah, I think it's had a major effect. One of the things that we've seen is that many, if you talk with people who become violent extremists, no matter what their political persuasion, and I've seen this here in the US and around the world, that many of them have experienced, not all, significant trauma as children or trauma as adults. And the trauma has broken up their way of broken up a kind of coherent and satisfying way of looking at the world, experiencing one's life. And so we're in a kind of state of chaos, which makes us reach out for something that's going to give us a firm solution and put the world right again. And we don't sometimes look so carefully at the subtleties of worldviews that may be far more black and white than they need to be. So I think the trauma has precipitated a lot of the difficulties that we see socially and politically, and certainly for people of color. It's made them far more fearful. It's also made them more likely to be targets of, whether it's of white supremacists or of anxious police. We work a lot with police at the Center for Mind-Body Medicine. They're very much on edge. They're on the front lines. And that doesn't improve their judgment, doesn't improve their capacity to deal with really challenging situations with the calm and understanding that's needed. Being a cop, being a policeman is an extraordinarily difficult job under any circumstances. And the trauma and the stress of the pandemic has made it much harder for them. So yes, I agree with you.
What about social media? How does that amplify or exacerbate trauma? Is it helpful to have kind of this collective experience, or is it hurtful by spreading kind of the hatred and vitriol that emanates sometimes from trauma?
Yes, it's both. I think, one of the things that's positive that's come about through social media and through the internet generally is people connecting with each other and overcoming loneliness, overcoming the isolation that's come. What we've discovered at the Center for Mind Body Medicine is that we can do our work, do online mind body skills groups with people and feel intimacy. I'm feeling pretty close to you as we're talking here on the screen. It's not the same, as when we're sitting in a room, but the more you do it, the more you can feel that connection. And I think that's been enormously valuable for people. The downside, of course, is that people have migrated to social media sites that simply confirm their preconceptions, and that because they want certainty, and in a time of disruption and trauma, we crave certainty. And many people have sort of glommed on to sites that confirm suspicions, prejudices, fears they've had before. And they keep going back and they keep being pushed back, as I understand it, by the search engines back to sites that reinforce these beliefs. And so this is the way they have chosen to resolve, at least temporarily, the trauma and the stress that they're feeling. It decreases their level of anxiety. They feel safe. Yes, I'm with people who believe the same way. I don't have to be afraid for my life, or I'm afraid, but I have other people who are with me and they will support me as I deal with these forces that are threatening me. So it goes both ways. I think it's been used in very sort of, and it's the terrible thing, of course, is that a lot of this is so cynical, as you well know. A lot of the exploitation, a lot of pushing some of these conspiracy theories is being done by people who know better, but they're trying to make money off doing this. They're trying to get more people viewing them. They have grievances, and even if they say, well, even if I'm not right on this, I'm generally right, so I'm going to push it and get other people to believe. And and we see this writ in public life in our Congress. As far as I know from talking with people, from members of Congress, the vast majority of people in Congress, including the Republicans, don't believe these conspiracy theories, but they publicly, they're at least going along with them, or they're supporting people who go along with them because it's useful for them. They feel they're going to, they're going to be more popular with the, and I'm generalizing a bit, but they do feel they're going to be more popular with the base, but they don't really believe all these things. So we're in a state which has been, again, catalyzed by trauma, in which this kind of false consciousness is flourishing. And there can be other kinds of false consciousness, and not just political, that flourish.
Well, let's talk about how some countries have dealt with collective trauma, because I think it could be very instructive. I was struck when I traveled to Berlin a few years ago to see how open and clear and tangible the memory of the Holocaust was. And I know they teach it in schools. And similarly in Rwanda, with the civil war there, which was so violent and horrendous, there's now a museum dedicated to understanding what happened between the Tutsis and the Hutus. And it seems to me that our country hasn't been able to really do that in a way that can help you process trauma and move forward. Is that a fair assessment?
I think that's extremely fair. I think what we have done, and this is what this is why what I'm working on now, and this is the arena in which I hope my book, Transforming Trauma, will serve an important role. It's crucial that the kind of discussion that we're having about individual and collective trauma be available to everybody in this country, and that the kind of programs that we've been doing at the Center for Mind Body Medicine for the last 20 some years be available to everybody. That is that I think that's the way we can do it here most easily on a collective level. We have to see this as a public health emergency. This is not a matter of, Katie or Jim has to go see a shrink and talk about. That's okay. That may be useful, but we're dealing with 330 million people, some of whom don't want to have anything to do with the therapist. Plus, what we're dealing with is not a psychiatric disorder. We're dealing with a normal reaction to an abnormal situation, and we have to understand that collectively, and we have to provide collective solutions. What I'm hoping we'll be able to do, and what I'm doing my best to talk to people in Congress and the Biden administration about, is train tens of thousands of people to be able to bring groups together, to give people an opportunity to talk about what's going on and to share their own experience and different experiences, different political perspectives, different colors, sizes, shapes, ages, to listen and then learn some practical techniques to come back into balance.
Well, perhaps one of the reasons that one of the things that led to Trumpism was people feeling like their trauma wasn't acknowledged or heard. And it seems to me that appropriately, Black Lives Matter and this national reckoning about racial injustice has gotten a lot of attention. But even listening to you now, there are a lot of people in other populations who have gone through not the same, but their own kinds of traumas, which I think get little attention and probably sympathy or appreciation. For example, in rural communities, as factories have shut down and the way of life that you thought you were going to be a part of has evaporated. That is a huge trauma and a huge loss for those communities. And I don't think we've paid enough attention to those losses. Do you?
I agree with you completely. We're working in one of those Appalachian communities in Western Maryland, and we're doing a program for the whole county. And so we're bringing together, I had in a group I was leading, I had cops, probation officers, people working in the prisons, along with former prisoners and teachers and people struggling with addiction. And it's the same process, and the same respect has to be accorded those communities. I think we have neglected them, and we have to see ourselves as much more connected to one another than we've been able to in recent years. And I agree with you. Those people have been neglected. Those people have been looked down on by many people. And we need to see them. We're all connected. We work with the Lakota people on the Pine Ridge Reservation and other places in the upper Midwest. And one of the things they say is that they talk about all my relations. We're all connected with each other, and we have to bring that consciousness back into the United States. And I hope that this will begin to happen now. This is the promise of the Biden administration.
You hope, but gosh, it doesn't seem as if we're making much progress. I wanted to go back to Germany because we're living in a society adhering to alternate facts. It's been called truth decay, or we live in a post-truth society. If the people of Germany didn't agree that the Holocaust happened, they would never be able to respond to it and to do everything they could to ensure it wouldn't happen again. How can we move forward if we cannot agree on a certain set of facts?
I don't think that we're going to come to that very easily. I think we have to not focus on that initially. What we have to focus on is coming together as human beings and sharing those parts of ourselves which we can understand with each other. So, for example, just a small example, after the war in Kosovo, when I was working with Serbs and Albanians who were murdering each other during the war. And afterwards, I was doing some work with groups, mixed groups of Serbs and Albanians. When they did drawings, they still feared, mistrusted, often hated each other. But when we did drawings in the groups, the drawings of the biggest problem that people did in the group, the Serbs and Albanians, were very similar. It was a solitary figure walking down a street, and around a corner that they couldn't see, there was somebody with an automatic weapon. And so the Albanians walking down the street, and around the corner from her was a Serb with an automatic weapon. When the Serb was walking down the street, around the corner was an Albanian with an automatic weapon. Literally, the drawings were mirror images of each other. And they saw, we may not agree on many things, but we're both afraid. We're human beings and we have fear. I think that's the way we need to start. And understanding a common set of facts, hopefully, will come later. Because that's a slow process. And I think it comes over time when people are ready. We have to bring people back into some kind of physiological and psychological balance for them to be open to that possibility. Because if everybody is in an anxious, agitated, or shut down, frozen state, how can they possibly look at something that is contrary to what they've been believing and sometimes staking their life in? So we have to work to help people come back into balance, to create that everywhere in this country. And we have to understand, I think one of the things about Germany is that they understood it was a collective problem. It's a problem for the whole society. With all this talk about patriotism from all quarters in the United States, we have really not understood that we are connected with each other. And those of us who do have that understanding, our job is to make sure that we bring that forward. This is not about arguing. We're not going to convince people that what they've been believing and they firmly believe is untrue. They may say, oh yeah, you're right, like the Congresswoman. I don't believe what she said. Wouldn't expect that. I think that we have to, on the one hand, legislators have to do what they do. On the other hand, those of us who are concerned with the health and well-being of the whole nation, as I hope our Congress people also are, we have to create a program for everybody that can be available to everybody, and to understand that Black lives matter, brown lives, and everybody's life matters. Those rural people, their lives matter too. And that's where it's going to start, I think. And then as that happens, as examples are set, public examples are set in the White House and Congress, in the media, and also as people begin to come more into balance, they can kind of relax. I've seen this when people are able to feel more at home with themselves, they're able to open to alternative possibilities. We saw this with our work in Gaza, for example, with kids who lost their dads, who were ready to die, to become suicide bombers, or I don't know if you saw that piece on 60 Minutes that featured our work with war traumatized kids in Gaza and Israel. I'll send it to you. But you see little kids in Gaza who wanted, after their dads were killed in the 2014 war, they wanted to become suicide bombers, or simply to let the Israelis kill them, because they wanted to join their dads in death, or they saw no other way to move forward. What we saw in working with those kids and helping them come into physical and psychological balance, and using all the tools in transforming trauma, they then began to be able to use their imagination and to imagine wholly different futures for themselves than they had when they started the process. So to me, this is something we have to make available here, everywhere, in hospitals, clinics, schools, community-based organizations, with police and firefighters. Just give them the opportunity to deal with their trauma, to come into balance, and then they will be able to access other possibilities. They'll be able to look at the world differently, not because
Well,
we're preaching to them.
how can you begin to heal from pandemic trauma? How can you be in a better balance? And what are the tools that everyone can take advantage of?
Well, that's what transforming trauma is about. That's why I wrote the book, is to give people a step-by-step guidebook to coming into balance and then using their imagination and reaching out to other people. The first understanding is what we were talking about at the beginning of our conversation. The trauma does affect us, and then it's going to come sooner or later to all of us. Doesn't mean you're crazy, doesn't mean you're abnormal, that you need to pay attention to the way the trauma has affected you, whether it's present trauma or past trauma. The second piece that's really important is to understand that it is possible to change, to move through and beyond the trauma. And that's one of the reasons that I tell stories in the book of people who have done that, who have gone from being horribly traumatized, whether it's by wars or by terrible physical and sexual abuse when they were children, who have grown up to be remarkable adults, or who have, as adults, changed profoundly. And then giving people very practical tools. I teach people, and you're breathing slowly and deeply right now.
I know, because I know what you're going to say. And I
Yeah,
don't do
we
it,
do that.
but I want to do it, and I need to do it.
We
You're
all
talking
do.
about meditation or mindfulness exercises.
Yeah, and what I teach is so simple. It's so easy. Just breathe slowly and deeply in through the nose and out through the mouth with your belly soft and relaxed. That is the antidote to the fight or flight response. That's what begins to bring our brains fully back online. We decrease activity in that amygdala, in the center of fear and anger. We increase activity in our frontal cortex, in the areas of thoughtful decision-making and self-awareness and compassion. And simply relaxing with our breath makes it easier to connect with each other. So that's one technique. Second one that's really important is movement, moving the body, exercise. I know you know this, the enormous value of moving our bodies and decreasing our level of stress and improving our mood. Exercise is as good a treatment for anxiety and depression as anything we have available on the planet. And the studies are there. This is science. This is not imagination or wishful thinking. So moving your body, and then we teach them expressive meditations, because one of the things, the terrible things that happens with trauma is, in addition to going into fight or flight, which continues, sometimes if the trauma is overwhelming and inescapable, as it has been for many people during this period of the pandemic, is they just shut down, they freeze, because there's nothing to do. So at that point, we shut down physically, and I'm sort of hunching over a little here. We shut down emotionally. We numb ourselves to the pain. And expressive meditations, shaking and dancing, fast, deep breathing, laughing, jumping up and down, shouting, crying, those help to break up the freeze response. So we come back into balance. And the more balance, the more we're in a state of balance, the easier it is to use all the self-care techniques, the easier it is to use guided mental imagery to help us solve problems and think through issues that are confounding, the easier it is to express ourselves in words or drawings, or the more we can get out of doing something simple like watching a TV show or reading a book or reading a newspaper. We're relaxed. We're getting more out of it. We're moving back into a more balanced, quote, normal life. So there's a whole program. The whole purpose of Transforming Trauma is to give readers a step-by-step program that anybody who can read can follow it. And if you can't read, that's okay. You can get an audiobook and you can follow it there. And we've used this program with kids as young as 3. In preschools and nursery schools, we teach preschool teachers to use it. Then they use it and adapt it for the kids.
I was going to bring this full circle and talk about young people, because you say that young adult population has been very severely affected by this pandemic. I have a 25-year-old daughter who is living a life she didn't anticipate, not seeing her friends, working from home. There's so many younger kids and that may be affected, a whole generation potentially, by this pandemic. I'm sure a lot of parents would be grateful to hear just a few tips on helping their kids reach an equilibrium amidst all this uncertainty and all this change?
Sure. I think the first thing, and it's a little like that cliche about the oxygen mask in the airplane. The first thing is you have to come back into balance. Otherwise, you're going to be talking to your kids out of fear and anxiety, and they're not going to be able to, you're not going to be able to tune into what's actually going on. And at the same time, you're not going to be able then to give them any advice if you don't understand what's happening with them. So take care of yourself. Use this program, use this transforming trauma program first for yourself. Then sit down. My son is away at school. Every Sunday, we're talking on the phone, and I'm tuning into what's going on with him. I'm really letting him have an opportunity to talk about whatever he wants to talk about and finding out what are the issues for him. And I think this is, every parent has to do this and not assume that we know what's going on with our kids. Probably not at any time, but definitely not in this time. And what may be troubling them may be very different from what we think is troubling them. So we need to give them some time, some opportunity to tell us what's going on. And then as far as sharing guidance with them, there will be an opening. I'll give you an example. This is a pre-pandemic example. My son, not at all, well, only remotely interested in all the things that I've been doing all these years. He started getting more interested in what I had to teach when he started playing basketball seriously, and he found himself tense. At that point, he became interested in soft belly breathing, so that when you're standing on the foul line, you want to breathe slowly and deeply and relax so that your percentage of shooting fouls will get higher. That's where I could meet him. Right now, I can meet him as he's thinking about college and all the uncertainty and all his hopes for what he's going to do. He's hoping to play Division I, actually it's football right now in college. So I need to listen to him, and I need to help him think through, how does he approach this and how does he deal with people who are reaching out to him? And that's what he wants to talk about. And, how is it going to happen with the limitations of the pandemic? So we need to understand what they're going through and then offer something that makes sense to them when they're ready to hear it.
I was interviewing somebody at some point, and I thought it was interesting. I think it was someone who said, getting in the car and taking a car ride is sometimes a really great opportunity to have these kind of heart-to-heart conversations with a child, because they feel less pressure. It's more relaxed. They don't have to look at you. And I thought that was a really interesting piece of advice that just can open up a conversation that you might not be able to have if you sort of sit down and say, hey, what's on your mind? What's troubling you? Just as a more natural environment.
I think that's right. And also the activities, and perhaps especially with younger kids, but not just with younger kids. One of the things that I've seen in parents of kids who are still at home is that those who are learning to take care of themselves, the parents, are also finding many ways to connect with their kids that they hadn't before. My goddaughter, for example, is going bike riding with her young kids almost every day. And this is new. I mean, they might have done it every few weeks before, but they're connecting with each other, and they're actually getting to know each other better during this pandemic than they did before. Also, I think it's important for parents, if your kids are saying, I've been in front of the screen for 4 hours, it's driving me crazy, let them have a little break. It is too much. We can't do the same. I think kids in schools have far too little physical activity in any case when they're able to go to school in person. And on screen keeps them even more confined. So this is an opportunity to do all kinds of activities with your kids, which it turns out it's good for the kids and it's good for us as parents. And the connection is growing much stronger. And I've seen this in families I've been talking with all over the country where they've been spending more time with each other, those that haven't simply said that, oh my God, this is driving me crazy, but who have taken advantage of the situation. So I think that's a very important, and ride it, whether it's riding in a car or cooking a meal or going for a bike ride or making a doll. Those are enormously helpful things to do, and they are also calming. And the connection itself is calming. So don't worry so much about the quote symptoms. And unless if your child says, I'm really worried about sleeping and I'm having trouble, or you find the kid is, having trouble sleeping, then you can have a conversation. And then I always begin with the question, would you like to learn something that might help you sleep better or study better or get along better with your friends, whom you're texting to? And that's the place to meet, and the place where they have a need and they have a desire for change. And then kids will do amazing things. If they're not interested, it's going to be very hard.
Well, it's so great to talk to you. We've been having a wonderful conversation with Dr. James Gordon, who has a new book out called Transforming Trauma: The Path to Hope and Healing, someone I've known for the past 20 plus years. So it's great to see you again, Jim, and talk to you about such important issues. And hopefully this has been helpful to everyone listening. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Katie. It's great to be with you. And also, if people want to learn more about what we're doing, they can go to the website, cmbm.org. There's a lot more material in addition to Transforming Trauma. And we have groups that people can join. Total sliding scale. Nobody's ever turned away. Online groups to learn techniques, to share their experience. We have training programs, and we're going to be reaching out more widely. So I'm so glad to be with you and to have this opportunity to share this with your community. And I hope to see you soon again.
Me too, at some point. Thanks, Jim.
Yeah, maybe even in person too.
Yeah.